Well, it's great to reconnect with Paula Wells, a prolific writer in Ottawa and on politics, who Paul and I crossed paths many times when he was with the Montreal Gazette years ago, and we've kept in touch by email and by phone, and really was excited, Paul, to get a copy of your new book, Justin Trudeau Against the Ropes, and that's what we're here to talk about. But first of all, remind our viewers, you lived in Montreal for 9 years. Take us back.
Well, I wasn't that lucky. I wrote for the Gazette for 9 years, but about half of that time,
Oh, true.
I was an Ottawa reporter for them here in Ottawa, which is where they keep the Ottawa reporters.
Right.
But yeah, the Gazette was my first big job in journalism. I got an internship there right out of Western University, and I basically learned how to be a journalist at the Gazette. I was there until the National Post launched in 1998.
What were you covering mainly for the Gazette during those years before you went to Ottawa?
Anything that moved. I filled in as the health reporter. I was the education reporter for a year before I came to Ottawa. But I was general assignment. I started as an intern and worked my way up. So, I mean, I was part of the large team of reporters that covered the Polytechnique massacre and Oka and the shooting at Concordia University and later at Dawson College, and murders, fires, mayhem, court cases. One time, this is a million years ago, the Gazette fired their society columnist, and she sued and took them to court, and I covered that.
Oh gosh, yes, I know exactly what you're talking about.
She ended up winning. That was fun. That was so I was covering my own bosses losing a court case. But anyway, so you learn a lot of stuff.
Absolutely. So were you always interested in politics, or was it going to Ottawa that really got you into politics?
I was always interested. My degree from Western was in political science. I took a school year off early on when I was at the Gazette and went to study politics at the Institut d'études politiques in Paris, because I didn't think I was getting taken seriously enough as a potential political writer. And I came back, and they took me serious for whatever reason, and they sent me to Ottawa just several months before the referendum. So I came back to cover the referendum. It was always what I wanted to write about. I'm confused by journalists who don't want to write about politics, although that's most journalists. But anyway.
Well, listen, you've risen to prominence. I mean, really, you really are one of the top noted persons in Canada. You've moderated debates with prime ministers. I mean, you've done some pretty big stuff. So you went from the Gazette. Did you go to Maclean's from there?
No, I was day one at the National Post. When we launched in 1998, I was one of the first day staffers, and I stayed with the Post for 5 years, and then to Maclean's.
Right.
And then 19 years at Maclean's, God save me. And and then they started to take the magazine. New owners took the magazine in a new direction in 2022, and I decided it was time for me to exit. So I've been independent ever since.
Okay, so Maclean's, you really dug deep. You really you must have really enjoyed your run there. You were writing a lot of commentaries. You were really right in the thick of things.
It was a great Canadian institution, and it enjoyed a sort of a renaissance when Ken White, who had been the founding editor of the National Post, came to become the editor and publisher of Maclean's in 2005. And we had more than a decade of coverage that was not afraid to be in depth, was not afraid to be controversial, and that allowed me really all the latitude I wanted to write about what I wanted in the way that I wanted. It was, and then as the whole news industry goes into a sort of a none too gentle decline, Rogers sold Maclean's to some new folks who were less interested in covering politics. So off I went.
Okay, so you have written this book on Justin Trudeau, which I really enjoyed. I liked the fact that it was less than 100 pages. It was a really fun but easy read. But how many books have you written before that? I believe you did one on Stephen Harper.
Yeah, so the big one on Stephen Harper is it's called The Longer I'm Prime Minister, and it's 11 years ago now, is the biggest book that I've written. This one is
Right.
my fourth book.
Okay.
To appear between covers. And you're right, it's essentially an essay.
That's what it really is. It's really like not, it's a book. I mean, you buy it, it's a soft cover, easy, small book, but it's an essay, but a good summary and kind of opinions minced in.
Yeah. And again, it's this guy, Ken White, who now runs a publishing company, Sutherland House. And he said to me, how come we still don't really understand what drives Justin Trudeau, what motivates him, and I'd like you to write in this series of short essays on contemporary topics that they're publishing called Sutherland Quarterly. I wrote an installment last year on the Commission of Inquiry into the Freedom Convoy,
Yeah.
and then I've written this one, and he just said, come up with a theory of Justin Trudeau, explain him to people. And so I thought that was worth the exercise. And so Justin Trudeau on the Ropes is the result of that.
Yeah, yeah. I keep saying against the ropes, but on the ropes. I mean, you explained it early on in the book. And when I think of that, I think of the boxing match. So the boxing match that he had against Senator Patrick Brazeau, the way you write it, that was one of the greatest things that happened to Justin Trudeau. It brought him into a new realm.
It seems ridiculous to say so, but I think the facts bear it out. He did this really because he had a lot of time on his hands. He was not a key member of the Liberal caucus in
No.
2012. They had the worst defeat of their life, reduced to fewer than 40 MPs. Bob Rae was brought in as interim leader, and he did not give Trudeau crucial tasks in Parliament. And so Trudeau was able to do a charity boxing match. I think it was a bit of a midlife crisis. He just turned 40.
Yeah.
But everyone expected him to lose. He didn't lose. Brazeau was a far more formidable looking fellow.
Yeah.
But Trudeau actually had more experience in boxing rings, and he trained hard, and he had a reach advantage, which matters a lot in boxing, and he won. And I mean, 9 weeks later, he was on the cover of Maclean's. I wrote the story saying maybe
Right.
the Liberal leader.
Yeah.
It seemed such a ridiculous thing to suggest at the time that I was worried that it would wreck my credibility as a political writer. But he became the Liberal leader, and he has seen that boxing match as sort of an operating metaphor for his career ever since. Smart money always counts him out. Smart money always says this guy is done, and yet he wins anyway. And he understands that boxing isn't politics. He understands that there are no guarantees in life. But he has been mentioning that boxing match lately to people who trust him. And
Interesting.
So, yeah.
So, wow, I would love to see a boxing match between him and Pierre Poilievre. That would be really powerful. I don't think it'll ever happen, but honestly, I think about it because it's almost like the House of Commons is almost like a daily verbal boxing match between them.
Yeah, and it gives certain advantages to opposition leaders. You don't have to account for what you've done because you're not in government. You get to pick the topic, but Poilievre is also highly skilled, and he prepares, and he's been working on this. There's a new book coming out next week by Andrew Lawton about Poilievre, which reminds us that he's been working on his skills and on his ideas since he was 14, and he's a formidable guy.
Yeah.
Trudeau's not at his best in the House of Commons, but he thinks he's got advantages in other ways, and So,
on the ropes, this interview will air in early June, so we're pre-recording it a bit. But what do you think? Do you think Trudeau is going to stick it out to the next election, or you think he's going to leave?
I think he absolutely intends to stay. And just recently, I was talking to someone who's close to Trudeau, has worked with Trudeau, who said the end of his marriage last year is significant in this frame because that was a decision that the couple made to kind of clear the decks so that he could concentrate on the next election. I mean,
Right.
obviously, among a million other reasons,
Of course.
but the timing of it, and that confirms the sense that whatever other people think about how serious he is or how suitable he is, he's deadly serious, and he believes he's more suitable than anyone else, and he plans to run. The only caveat I would add is that there's a year or more until the next election. That's a lot of time for things to happen. But I believe that as of today, he intends to run again.
And as a political pundit and others, do you think he has a chance to beat Poilievre? I mean, he's so far behind in the polls.
I believe he's got a greater than zero chance. But I'm not going to bet. I don't bet on election outcomes. I would not bet heavily on him winning. Quite the contrary. But these decisions are taken above my pay grade. This is why we have
right.
It's up.
Yeah, exactly. Well, listen, if Poilievre wins a minority, Trudeau leaves and a new leader comes in, the Liberals have a chance to maybe win an election 18 months later. So who knows? It's going to be very interesting to follow. He's certainly not showing the signs, by going to Philadelphia and well, let me ask you this, because if he doesn't resign and Donald Trump, you talk about this in the book as well, Donald Trump wins the election, how is that going to work? They didn't seem to get along at all, Trudeau and Trump.
Yeah. So I don't believe that the U.S. presidential election will have a particular influence on how Canadians vote. I believe that Donald Trump is going to be a difficult president. Well, I don't even take it for granted that Trump will win this election. I think Joe Biden continues to be obviously he's unpopular, and
yeah,
I believe he's underestimated as a political performer even now.
Yeah.
That being said, let's assume for the sake of argument that Trump is the next president. He would be difficult for any Canadian prime minister to.
Even Poilievre, because they liken to him a little bit.
Yeah, Trump doesn't care. Trump doesn't pay close attention to Canadian politics. He's not in the business of helping any foreign leader politically.
Yeah.
And he views Canada broadly as an economic challenge to the United States and an annoyance. And I don't think that would be, I don't think that would change a lot.
Yeah.
I don't think that would have been different, particularly if Stephen Harper had been prime minister for the Trump presidency. But the other part of it is a liberal prime minister in a antagonistic relationship with a President Trump is not upsetting any of his followers because liberal voters don't like Trump.
Right.
Some conservative voters like Trump fine, and some conservative voters really don't. And so I think it's a much more difficult management problem for a conservative prime minister.
Right.
One of the things I wish I had been able to watch was how Stephen Harper would have governed as Canada's prime minister during a Trump presidency.
Good point.
I think he would have found it quite a puzzle how to proceed day to day.
Yeah. You also write in the book about, again, with your theme about all the controversies that would have buried a lot of politicians, yet Trudeau seems to escape them. Blackface, the controversy where he had to fire his justice minister, more or less. He basically demoted her. And Orange Shirt Day when he just went on vacation with Sophie instead of going to the celebration. I mean, there's a long line. How does he get away with all this stuff?
So I think part of the explanation is the increasing polarization in our politics, which one of the things I point out is that he ran the first time in 2015 as a moderate who was trying to hold the political center. He believed that Harper had abandoned the center and that it was up for a Liberal to grab it. So he was ran on middle class economic opportunity, made fun of Harper for running 8 consecutive deficit budgets, seemed to imply that he would be more fiscally responsible than Harper, and he really underplayed his climate policies and all the diversity and inclusion stuff that came later. He didn't really run that hard on that stuff in 2015. What he soon found was that the center in our politics is crumbling, has been crumbling since before he came along, and continued. Yeah. So as voters were picking a lane, you were either broadly on the left or broadly on the right, and you had less and less patience with the other stream in our politics. Politicians had to pick a lane, and so Trudeau participated in that polarization after about 2018. With this result, by 2019, he could get away with all kinds of mistakes, stupidities, bad decisions, and a large number of voters would forgive him because they viewed the Conservatives as worse. And similarly for Conservative leaders. Like, an interesting thing is that even though Scheer and Aaron O'Toole were very different leaders, they got a very similar vote.
Yes.
And that vote will be the basis of what Poilievre gets. So what I'm saying is there's fewer votes with these than there used to be.
Right.
So Trudeau could screw up and people would stick with the Liberals.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Exactly. So I was just going to ask you, the COVID pandemic, you believe in the book that Trudeau did a pretty good job?
Yeah, in the first year. Basically, in the first year of COVID, when nobody knew what we were dealing with, the main objective was to keep people apart so that the virus couldn't spread. And to do that, you had to pay people to stay home, and you had to pay businesses to stay open, even though they had no clients. And that just required a hell of a lot of money. The 4 prime ministers before Trudeau had been fiscally responsible, and so Canada had more money to spend on that than anyone else.
Right.
And so Canada had relatively lower death rates than a lot of other countries.
Right.
Lower than any G7 country except for Japan. Later in the pandemic, when vaccines become available, it becomes a much more complicated story. But in the first year of COVID, I think he's got a good story to tell.
Yes. The Senate, did he do a good job in terms of, he said he would reform the Senate and the way they were selected. I mean, you talk about that in the book as well.
So I think the Senate is a much more interesting place than it used to be. There's a lot of interesting people there with, and it hasn't been a huge hindrance to the legislative process. But it's kind of leaderless, rudderless. The overwhelming majority of senators are independent, although they usually end up voting for government legislation. And it may be a problem for a future government that isn't Liberal, because there's no real leader for 3/4 of the senators, and
right.
So I think the jury is still out on that. But his objective was remember that in 2014, 2015, everyone hated the Senate. They were so angry about spending scandals and so on like that. So his objective was to insulate the Liberal Party from that, and I think on that limited basis, it worked.
Right.
Nobody except conservative senators blames the Liberals for anything that's going on in the Senate. So
my last question is, you talk a lot about in the book, which is true. He's benefited from his name. Like you said, no one, it wasn't a news story when Paul Martin Jr. was born, like you write, and I got a laugh out of that. But, from the moment he was born, he's had that name recognition. And do you think that's why he is where he is today still?
Well, there's a lot of people with glamorous names who haven't succeeded long in politics. I mean, people are impressed by a Trudeau in politics up to a certain point.
Right.
And I say near the end of this book is critical of Trudeau, but not dismissive of him. And I say near the end that in June, he will pass. So at sort of any day now, he will pass Louis Saint Laurent for longevity. He'll have been prime minister for longer than Pearson, longer than Diefenbaker, longer than Louis Saint Laurent. And you can't really take that away from him.
No, you can't.
But there's room for all kinds of discussion about, you know, the decisions he's made along the way.
Yeah.
But I would say the Trudeau name lasts, you know, until sort of partway through the first campaign, and the people decide whether they're going to vote for this guy.
Right.
You know, the French expression, se faire un prénom, to make a first name for yourself.
Right, right.
I think, and it goes both ways. He's succeeded on his own terms, and the people who are mad at him are mad at Justin Trudeau. They're not mad at Pierre Trudeau anymore.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. Well, it's a fascinating read. I urge viewers to get a copy of it. And is there another book coming, Paul?
I'm overdue to catch up with a publisher who wants another book from me. I suspect in the next year or so, you might be hearing from me again.
Well, I hope so. Well, thanks for joining us. Keep up the great work, and we'll see you in Ottawa.
Thanks so much, Mike.
Great talking to Paul Well.